thank you for the invitation again, and I will speak in English, but I'm happy to respond to questions in French if I can participate in the event itself. I was asked to cast some doubt on the idea that China is a kind of monolithic other, a kind of fundamentally different society and civilization compared to what we are used to in the West. And I'm from Canada, from Montreal, and of course I'm from the Western context as well. I think that there's also this idea contributes to what we can call the demonization of China in the Western media. There's hardly any reports of good stuff happening in China, and China is presented as kind of monolithic whole that's both different and bad from a kind of Western perspective. I think that's just empirically wrong. For one thing, China is not a monolithic whole. In fact, it's highly diverse. I mean, it makes more sense to think of China as a kind of European continent, so diverse. I mean, not just the rural area and the city areas and the different parts of China where there's ethnic groups and religious groups, the very geographically diverse China, but also even the cities are so different. I mean, any of you who have been to China, you know that Beijing and Shanghai are just so different, and frankly speaking, often people from those cities don't like each other. They regard themselves as very different as well. You can say, well, that's kind of empirical. What about from a kind of normative point of view? Is China really as bad as is presented typically in the Western media? Well, here too, I mean, again, it's a gross exaggeration. There's many bad things happening in China. The repression in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, frankly, increased censorship, which is not good for academics like me. But there's also a lot of good stuff happening. For one thing, since the early mistakes in Wuhan, now China has done a good job, relatively speaking, at dealing with COVID. I mean, it's a huge country. We're basically free to lead normal lives, go to cafes, go to restaurants, go to schools, go to universities, go to business, and to travel within this whole kind of continent, because China the government has done a good role of dealing with COVID with the strong support of the people. Many other things are reasons to make us optimistic. China is taking the environment much more seriously than before, with a strong commitment, not just to short-term environmental progress, but to dealing with climate change in the long term. Poverty reduction, I mean, we can use whatever words we use. I mean, it's an amazing achievement that it's estimated that 800 million Chinese have been lifted out of poverty. As an academic, I'm fascinated by the rise or the revival of traditions, including Confucianism. There's very lively debates about Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, which was basically dead for most of the 20th century. So there's lots of good stuff happening in China as well. I think there's reasons to be optimistic for the long term as well as bad things. So we have to ask, why is there this demonization? It's gotten much worse of late. Why? Why is it happening? Not just in, I mean, of course the media portrayal is part of it, but it's quite common among political leaders in the West, sometimes who travel to China, and even ordinary people ordinary citizens who don't know, who come to China sometimes. I think that people who come to China actually usually have a much more nuanced picture, and it's very important to have more exchanges, both of ordinary citizens in terms of travel, but also academic exchanges, NGOs, more business interchange, and of course more political exchanges to deal with common challenges like global warming and so on. That's hugely important, and I think the more of that there is, the less demonization there'll be. But what's really driving it? What's driving this demonization, this view that China is a kind of fundamental enemy to the West and is out to undermine the West, and we really should worry about it? I think basically there's a view, and it's become much more prominent in the past few years, that China is different and it's not going to become like us. I mean, especially in the US, I think maybe in France to a certain extent, in Canada where I'm from, there's a view that China is reforming economically, becoming more market society, and eventually it's going to become it's going to liberalize politically, and it'll become just like a Western-style liberal democracy, but it'll just take time. It's just a matter of time. But now I think there's recognition, and I think it's accurate recognition, that no, China won't necessarily become like us in many ways. It has its own traditions and cultures, its own ways of organizing the economy, its own ways of organizing politics that'll differ in many important ways from Western-style liberal democracies. Now, is that a problem? Well, let me just say there's two reasons not to view it as a problem. The first is that in some ways there is substantial commonality of values, including political values. At the level of principle, China, including its leaders and intellectuals and common people, are committed to basic human rights. The idea that individuals have a right not to be tortured, not to be killed, not to be enslaved, not subject to genocide. In principle, nobody, will seriously disagree with that. In that sense, it's similar to the West. Who disagrees with that? Only at the level of principle, only crazy terrorists, right? But at the level of principle, there's no dispute here. It's not a moral argument. I mean, of course, there's always a gap between the ideal and the reality. And in that sense, it's more of an empirical argument. It's a matter of exposing the gap between the ideal and the reality of commitment to basic human rights. That's true in China. It's also true in Western countries. The US and France also commit horrible human rights abuses, and we need to expose them. But again, it's not a moral argument, it's an empirical argument. In traditional China, there was a different view, right? There was a view that you can torture people in very brutal ways in public as a way of kind of punishment. Nobody in China openly defends that view anymore. So in this sense, there has been convergence, and we can argue that both the West and China have progressed to a common moral commitment in that sense. What about democracy? Well, it's true that in most of Chinese history, there wasn't a commitment to democracy in the sense of participation by ordinary people. But here too, there's been a change, and to a certain extent, we can call it a convergence with Western views. There is a view that common people in China, to a certain extent, can and should participate in politics through deliberative forums. They should be consulted to a certain extent about what they want. They should participate in local experiments about ways of organizing politics. There's a lot of diversity in China, a lot of local experimentation. And elections, too, are very common and widely accepted at local levels, at the village level. It's estimated that about 900 million Chinese have participated in elections at local levels. So where exactly is the area of disagreement? Again, the area of moral disagreement. Well, it's not about the idea that people can and should participate in politics. It's about the idea that top-level leaders should be selected by means of one person, one vote. There is here a difference in principle, of course, in reality as well. Now, in the West, we think, they oppose democratic elections. That means that they favor authoritarianism. And authoritarianism, of course, is pejorative, right? If you're against democracy, it means you favor authoritarianism. And all the countries that are against democracy are lumped up together. North Korea, family-run dictatorships. Today we see Myanmar, military-run dictatorships. You have similar dictatorships in Egypt and in Thailand, or else Saudi Arabia, family-run kind of sultans, or however you want to describe it. And China, they're all lumped up together. That's ridiculous. Let me speak. I know I'm only allowed to speak for 10 more minutes, but I need 5 more minutes. I hope you'll forgive me. What really distinguishes China from these other non-democratic political systems? Well, for one thing, it's worth noting that there's been tremendous amount of political reform in China. There's a myth in the Western media that's very popular. A lot of economic reform, although that's stalled of late, meaning more market reform, but no political reform because the same political party is still in place, still in power. If you look beyond that, over the difference in China now between China and the Cultural Revolution, this period of chaos, 1966 to 76, and now, 40 years later, it's a totally different political system. What is the main difference? It's an effort to reestablish a kind of political meritocracy, which means that the political system aims to select and promote public officials on the basis of superior ability and virtue. In Chinese, 贤能政治. It's a very old ideal, goes back 2,500 years. And institutionally, it means that we need a complex bureaucracy designed to select and promote such officials. And those who rise through the political system, it's a decades-long political process, have to have a lot of political experience at different levels of government, in villages, in poor areas, in rich areas, until they become leaders at higher levels of government. It's a very old ideal and has meritocratic mechanisms, most famously the examination system, which is used to select leaders with higher ability and well, whether or not it selects virtue is a controversy in Chinese history, an ongoing controversy now. Now, this is the ideal that motivates political change, and I think it has inspired much political reform. China is very much different now, complex bureaucracy, all government leaders have a lot of political experience, and there's still a gap, though, between the ideal and the reality. Remember, leaders should have superior ability and virtue. What's virtue? At bottom, it means don't be corrupt. So we still know there's a lot of corruption in the political system. So it means that there is a gap between the ideal and the reality. The question is, what standards should we use to assess political progress in China? And there's widespread agreement that that standard should be political meritocracy at higher levels of government and much more democracy at lower levels of government. That's the kind of ideal that motivates the Chinese political system. And if you want to describe China, we can call it a highly imperfect democratic meritocracy. Or let's just say a highly imperfect political meritocracy. Just as the US or France is a highly imperfect democracy, right? Now, should that worry us? Well, at one level, if we care about one person, one vote to select top leaders in China, I mean, yes, there is a challenge here. Because if competitive elections were to be implemented at higher levels of government, it would undermine the advantages of political meritocracy, which is that governments can engage in long-term planning, 10, 20, 30 years. If there were competitive elections, usually you'd have a 4 or 5 year horizon, not much longer. All leaders have political experience. They don't make beginners' mistakes. Leaders can spend more time focusing on policy as opposed to, say, spending a lot of time raising money like leaders in the US or giving the same speech over and over again, which is, think about it, a bit of a waste of time. Ideally, you want leaders to focus on policy. So China is against one person, one vote in principle at higher levels of government because it's necessary to maintain the advantages of political meritocracy. Now, does this mean that it's a challenge to the West? Well, no, China doesn't want to export its model. China recognizes that political meritocracy is important in China because it has a long political culture and because it's important in a large state like China to have more meritocratic mechanisms at higher levels. But countries that don't have this political culture, don't have a history of complex bureaucracy, forget about it. They're not going to, it's very hard to learn this model, and China has no interest in exporting this model. So there's no worry about it. China can build on its own model, just as the West should try to improve on its own democratic roots and foundations. And we should collaborate together on common challenges like climate change, global warming, regulation of nuclear weapons, regulation of dangerous forms of AI, and so on. I mean, I think that's all very important. And frankly speaking, in the West, we've become more closed-minded. We weren't always this way. In France, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of course, famously defended a very strong form of democracy, but when he was asked to advise a large state like the government of Poland, he defended a much less democratic and frankly much more bureaucratic form of organization, much closer actually to China's idea of political meritocracy. John Stuart Mill, the great British liberal, he opposed one person, one vote. He says not everybody has equal capacity to make political judgments, so we should give extra votes to educated people. We can argue about whether he had a good idea, but at least it was taken seriously. Now in the West, we've become very dogmatically attached to one person, one vote as the only morally legitimate way of selecting government leaders. We need to be much more open-minded to allow for other morally desirable possibilities, to recover this open-mindedness that we had in the past. So I'm going to end here. I think China also has a different case to make for it's the way that it organizes its economy. It won't be purely capitalist. I think it's still strongly committed to kind of the ideals of socialism at the level of principle. But because of lack of time, I will end here. Thank you very much. Je vous remercie.